You're a parasite, feeding parasites." Harrison Sterling's voice cut through the morning air like a knife, his expensive suit looking obscene against the dusty garage where Elias Vance had fed half the neighborhood for years. "You have 3 hours to get out, or I'm throwing everything you own into that dumpster." And he meant it. Before Elias could even respond, Harrison's crew grabbed his custom-built stove, the only thing he'd saved from the fire that destroyed his restaurant, his reputation, his entire life, and hurled it into the trash with a sickening crash. The street went silent. Elias stood there, a broken man, watching his dignity treated like garbage, while Harrison checked his Rolex like he had somewhere more important to be. Then 3 sounds shattered the tension, low, powerful, unmistakable, engines that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. 3 black Lamborghinis turned onto the block, moving like predators, and the smug smile on Harrison Sterling's face cracked and died. He was about to learn what happens when you throw the wrong man's life in the trash. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What happens next will leave you speechless. 15 years ago, Elias Vance had everything a chef could dream of. His own restaurant in the heart of downtown, walls lined with awards, a waiting list 3 months long, and a kitchen that smelled like ambition wrapped in butter and thyme. Food critics called him a genius. The city called him a rising star, and Elias, he just called it home. Then came the night that changed everything. It started with a grease fire in the back kitchen, small at first, manageable, the kind of thing that happens when you're running a dinner service for 80 guests and your line cook gets careless. But small fires don't stay small when you're in an old building with wiring that should have been replaced 20 years ago. Within minutes, the flames spread to the walls, the ceiling, the dining room. Elias tried to fight it, burned his hands pulling equipment out, screaming for his staff to get to safety, watching helplessly as smoke swallowed the place he'd poured his soul into for a decade. The fire department came, too late to save anything but the foundation. And that's when the real nightmare began. The insurance company found a loophole. Faulty wiring wasn't covered under his policy, they said. An act of negligence, they called it, as if Elias had personally installed the electrical system in 1973. They denied his claim. Every cent he'd invested, every loan he'd taken, every dream he'd built, gone in a single signature on a rejection letter. Within 6 months, Elias lost the restaurant, his savings, and his reputation. Word travels fast in the culinary world, and failure smells worse than burnt meat. The investors who used to return his calls stopped answering. The banks that used to offer him loans suddenly had nothing available. Friends became strangers. Strangers became ghosts. By the time the eviction notice came for his apartment, Elias had already learned to live small. He sold what he could, donated what he couldn't, and packed his life into the back of a borrowed truck. The only thing he kept was his custom-built stove, a 6-burner beast he'd designed himself, the one piece of equipment he'd managed to drag from the fire before the roof collapsed. That stove became his altar, his last piece of dignity. He found work where he could. Catering gigs that paid under the table, prep cook shifts at diners that didn't ask questions, and eventually a garage in a forgotten neighborhood on the east side, the kind of place where rent was cheap because hope was cheaper. The owner didn't care what Elias did as long as the check cleared, so Elias set up shop, cleaned the oil stains off the concrete floor, rigged up ventilation with duct tape and determination, and turned a mechanic's garage into a place where the broken could still eat like kings. He didn't have a sign, didn't need one. Word spread the old-fashioned way, through empty stomachs and full hearts. People came because the food was good and the prices were honest. Day laborers, single mothers, elderly folks on fixed incomes, kids who walked home from school alone. Elias fed them all. Not because he was a saint, but because he understood something most people forget. Dignity starts with a hot meal, and when the world takes everything else from you, sometimes a plate of food made with care is the only thing reminding you that you're still human. He thought he'd lost everything in that fire. He didn't know yet that he was about to find something worth more than any restaurant could ever be. The night Elias found them, the temperature had dropped to freezing, the kind of cold that turns breath into fog and makes your bones ache. It was late, past midnight, and he was closing up the garage after a long day of feeding people who paid in crumpled bills and quiet thank yous. He'd just killed the lights when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not footsteps, not voices, something softer, desperate, scratching. Elias grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the dumpster in the alley behind the garage. The beam of light caught movement, small and quick, like animals scattering. But these weren't animals. They were children. 3 of them, identical, boys who looked like they'd been carved from the same piece of pale, starving marble. Skeletal frames wrapped in clothes 3 sizes too big, fabric hanging off their shoulders like they were playing dress-up in a tragedy. Their hair was matted, their faces smudged with dirt, and their eyes, those gray, hollow eyes, stared at him like he was either salvation or the next person who'd hurt them. Elias's throat tightened. He'd seen poverty before. He'd fed it, worked alongside it, lived in it. But this was different. These boys looked like ghosts who'd forgotten how to haunt. "Hey," Elias said softly, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "You okay?" The 3 didn't move, didn't speak, just pressed closer together, as if their bodies were the only shelter they had left. Elias crouched down slowly, keeping his distance. He'd learned that frightened things don't trust sudden movements. "When's the last time you ate?" One of them, the boy in the middle, opened his mouth like he wanted to answer, but nothing came out. His lips were cracked, his hands were shaking. Elias didn't wait for permission. He stood, walked back into the garage and fired up the stove. The boys watched from the doorway, too scared to come in, too hungry to leave. Within minutes, the smell of butter hitting hot iron filled the air, followed by garlic, onions, and the kind of richness that makes your stomach wake up and beg. He made them plates, real plates, not leftovers, not scraps, the same food he'd serve a paying customer. Grilled chicken with herbs, roasted vegetables, bread still warm enough to steam when you tore it open. "Come on," Elias said, setting the plates on an old workbench. "It's safe here." The 3 boys looked at each other, communicating in that silent language siblings have when words aren't enough. Then, slowly, they stepped inside. They sat together on a single wooden crate, shoulder to shoulder, like separating even an inch would break something fragile. And then they ate. Fast at first, like animals who didn't know when the next meal was coming. Then slower, as if their bodies finally understood. This wasn't a trick. This was real. Elias watched them and felt something crack open in his chest. He didn't know their names yet, didn't know their story, but he recognized the look in their eyes because he'd seen it in his own mirror after the fire. The look of someone the world had decided to forget. One of the boys, the smallest one, looked up at him with tears streaming down his dirty face. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. His eyes said it louder than words ever could. And that's when Elias noticed it. All 3 boys were clutching something in their free hands, holding it like a lifeline. A small, tarnished object that caught the light just enough to shimmer. A brass compass. Broken, beautiful, and completely useless, with a needle that spun in circles, pointing nowhere. They came back the next night, and the night after that, and the one after that. Elias never asked them to, never made promises he couldn't keep, but every evening around the same time, just as the sun bled out behind the buildings, 3 identical shadows would appear in the alley. Same hollow eyes, same too big clothes, same desperate silence. And every night, Elias fed them. He learned their names slowly, like earning trust from wild animals. The one in the middle, the one who seemed to carry the weight of all 3, was Julian. The quietest one, the one who watched everything with calculating eyes, was Silas. And the smallest, the one whose emotions lived right on the surface of his skin, was Caleb. Twins, born 3 minutes apart in that exact order, like the universe had decided to give them ranks. They didn't talk much at first, just ate with that same frantic carefulness, like the food might disappear if they blinked. But after 2 weeks, Julian finally spoke. "Why do you help us?" Elias was washing dishes, his hands deep in soapy water. He didn't turn around, just kept scrubbing. "Because someone should have helped me when I fell, and nobody did." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could be. It was Caleb who broke it, his voice small and cracked. "Our parents died." Elias's hands stilled in the water. "Car accident," Silas added, his tone flat, like he'd said it so many times it didn't hurt anymore. "Foster care split us up, different houses, different families. They said it was easier that way." Elias turned around, drying his hands on a rag. Easier for who? The boys had no answer for that. "So we ran," Julian continued. "Found each other, stayed together." "They're still looking for us," Silas said. "That's why we move around, why we can't stay in shelters. They separate siblings." Elias felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same rage he'd felt when the insurance company denied his claim, when the banks refused his loans, when the system designed to help people decided it was easier to abandon them instead. "You're safe here," Elias said. "As long as I'm standing, you're safe here." Caleb looked down at his hands, at the tarnished brass compass he'd been fidgeting with since he sat down. All 3 boys had one, Elias had noticed, identical compasses, worn smooth from constant touching. "What's that?" Elias asked gently. Julian pulled his out, held it up to the light. "Our dad's. He was in the Navy. He gave us each one before he—" His voice trailed off. Silas opened his, and the needle inside spun uselessly. No direction, no purpose, just broken machinery pretending to work. "It doesn't point anywhere anymore," he said. Elias reached out his hand. "Can I see it?" The boys hesitated, then slowly, reverently placed all 3 compasses in his palm, like they were handing over pieces of their father's soul. Elias carried them to his workbench, the same bench where he'd served them that first meal. He pulled out his toolkit, the precision instruments he'd once used to plate Michelin-starred dishes, now repurposed for fixing things. For the next hour, the boys watched in silence as Elias worked. Tweezers, magnifying glass, steady hands that remembered how to care for delicate things. He cleaned the mechanisms, realigned the needles, adjusted the tiny gears that had been knocked loose by time and trauma. When he was done, he handed them back. All 3 needles pointed true north. Julian stared at his compass like it was magic. Silas's hands trembled as he held his. Caleb pressed his against his chest and cried without making a sound. "So you can always find your way home," Elias said softly. The boys looked at him, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not promises, just understanding. The next morning, when Elias opened the garage, they were gone. No note, no goodbye, just 3 empty spaces where 3 broken boys used to sit. Elias told himself it was better this way, safer for them, safer for him. But every night for weeks he set out 3 plates anyway, just in case they came back. They never did. 15 years passed like water through a sieve, slow, steady, impossible to hold on to. Elias's hair turned gray at the temples. His hands developed permanent burns and scars that told stories he didn't share. The garage became a fixture in the neighborhood, the kind of place people pointed to when giving directions. Turn left at the food garage. You can't miss it. He fed day laborers before dawn, construction workers on lunch breaks, elderly folks who couldn't cook anymore, kids walking home from school with empty stomachs and emptier stomachs. He charged what people could afford, which usually meant almost nothing. Some days he made $50. Some days he made $5. It didn't matter. The stove stayed hot, the doors stayed open, and Elias stayed standing. Until the morning Harrison Sterling's Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Elias was prepping vegetables when he heard the car door slam. Expensive sound, the kind of door that closes with German engineering and quiet arrogance. He looked up and saw a man in a suit that cost more than 3 months of Elias's rent, surveying the block like a general planning a conquest. "You're still here," Harrison said, not a question, an observation laced with disappointment. Elias wiped his hands on his apron, his stomach sinking. "I have a lease." Harrison smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Month to month, I checked." That's when Elias felt it, the shift, the thing he'd felt 15 years ago when the insurance adjuster walked into the burned remains of his restaurant with a denial letter already prepared. "You bought this block," Harrison continued, pulling out a rolled blueprint from his Mercedes. He spread it across the hood of his car like he was unveiling art. "Luxury condos, rooftop gardens, secured parking. This area has potential, but it needs to be cleaned up first." "Cleaned up?" The words hung in the air like an insult. "People live here," Elias said quietly. "People eat here." Harrison looked at him with the kind of pity reserved for children who don't understand how the world works. "People will eat somewhere else, better places. Once we raise the standards around here, you'll see, everyone benefits from progress." "Progress for who?" Harrison's smile tightened. "For people who can afford it. That's how economics works." He tapped the blueprint. "This garage, perfect location for a private parking structure. 150 units, reserved spots, premium rates." Elias felt his chest tighten. "I have a lease." "Which expires in 30 days, Harrison said, rolling up the blueprint with crisp efficiency. "I'm not renewing. You'll need to vacate by the 1st of next month." "That's not enough time to—" "30 days is generous," Harrison interrupted. "Legally, I only have to give you 15. Consider it a courtesy." He opened his car door, then paused. "Oh, and I'd advise against making this difficult. I have inspectors, permits, city connections. If you fight me on this, I'll make sure you never operate a food business in this city again." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never lost anything he couldn't replace. Harrison drove away, leaving Elias standing in front of the garage that had been his second chance, watching exhaust fumes dissolve into the morning air. Around him, the neighborhood moved like it always did. Cars honking, people shouting, life continuing because life doesn't stop for one man's eviction notice. But Elias knew what was coming. He'd seen it happen to other blocks, other businesses, other people who didn't have lawyers or leverage or the right last names. First came the eviction, then the inspectors, then the demolition crews, then the luxury condos with names like The Sterling or Riverside Heights that no one who actually lived by the river could afford. He walked back inside, stared at his stove, and felt the familiar weight of loss settling on his shoulders. 30 days. He didn't know if he had the strength to fall again. And he didn't know that across the city, in a glass tower with a view of everything, 3 men who owed him everything had just gotten a very interesting phone call. 2 weeks passed and Elias couldn't find another location. Every space was either too expensive, already leased, or in neighborhoods so far out that the people who needed him wouldn't be able to reach him. He spent his mornings calling landlords and his afternoons feeding the same people he'd been feeding for years, wondering how many meals he had left to serve. Then Harrison came back, and this time he brought company. 3 men in vests with clipboards, a woman with a tablet and a city badge. All of them walked into the garage like they owned it, which technically Harrison did. "Health and safety inspection," a woman announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "We received a complaint." "What kind of complaint?" Elias asked. "Unsanitary conditions, improper ventilation, potential health code violations." She rattled off the charges like she was reading a grocery list, her voice flat and bureaucratic. Harrison stood behind them, arms crossed, watching with that same thin smile he'd worn when he delivered the eviction notice. The inspectors moved through the garage with surgical precision, looking for problems like archaeologists searching for bones. They checked the grease trap, examined the fire extinguisher, measured the distance between the stove and the walls, swabbed surfaces, took photos. Elias knew his garage was clean. He scrubbed it every night until his hands cracked. But he also knew that when inspectors came looking for violations, they found them. A crack in the tile, a vent slightly out of code, a permit filed under the wrong classification. The woman made notes on her tablet, her fingers moving fast. One of the men pointed at the ventilation system Elias had rigged up himself. "This isn't up to commercial kitchen standards," he said. "It's been fine for 15 years, Elias replied, keeping his voice steady. "That doesn't make it legal." A small crowd had gathered outside. Regulars, people who ate here 3-4 times a week. Mr. Chen, who'd been coming since the beginning. Maria, whose kids Elias fed after school. Old Joe, who paid in dimes and gratitude. Harrison noticed the crowd and saw his opportunity. He stepped forward, raising his voice just enough to be heard. "This is exactly the problem," he said, gesturing at the garage like it was evidence in a trial. "This neighborhood has been operating on lowered standards for too long. No proper inspections, no accountability, just people doing whatever they want." Maria's face went red. "He feeds half this block for almost nothing." Harrison turned to her with rehearsed sympathy. "I understand he provides a service, but charity doesn't exempt anyone from health codes. What if someone gets sick? What if a child gets food poisoning? Who's responsible then?" The words landed like grenades. Doubt rippled through the crowd. A few people looked at each other uncomfortably. Elias felt the shame rising, hot and suffocating. Harrison was making him sound like a threat, like his kindness was actually negligence in disguise. "You see," Harrison continued, his voice smooth and reasonable, "this is why gentrification isn't a bad word. It's about raising standards, creating safe, regulated environments, protecting the community." Mr. Chen stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't care about protecting anyone. You just want us gone so you can build your expensive boxes." Harrison's smile never wavered. "I want what's best for this neighborhood's future, even if some people are too short-sighted to see it." The inspector with the clipboard cleared her throat. "Mr. Vance, we're going to need you to cease operations immediately pending a full review. You'll receive formal notice within 48 hours. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. "I have customers, people who depend on—" "I understand, but until these violations are addressed, you cannot serve food to the public. I'm sorry." Harrison checked his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. "Well, that settles it. You'll need to vacate even sooner now. Can't have a closed business taking up valuable real estate." He walked towards his Mercedes, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Elias, don't take this personally. It's just business. Nothing personal at all." That line, delivered with such casual cruelty, hit harder than any insult could, because Harrison actually believed it. Elias spent the next morning trying to salvage what he could: pots, pans, utensils, the small things he could carry alone. He moved slowly, methodically, like someone packing up a life they didn't want to leave behind. His stove sat in the center of the garage, too heavy to move without help. 6 burners, custom built, the only thing he'd saved from the fire 15 years ago. It wasn't just equipment, it was a monument to everything he'd survived. He'd called 2 friends who'd promised to come with a truck by noon. Just a few more hours and he'd have it safely stored until he figured out what came next. But Harrison Sterling didn't deal in hours. He arrived at 10 a.m. with a crew of 4 men in work boots and company shirts. A moving truck idled at the curb, engine rumbling like a threat. "Time's up," Harrison announced, stepping into the garage without knocking. Elias straightened up from the box he was packing. "I have until the end of the day. The inspector said you couldn't operate. She didn't say you could camp out here dragging your feet." Harrison gestured to his crew. "Gentlemen, clear it out." Elias's pulse spiked. "Wait, I have people coming to help me move the stove. Just give me 2 hours." Harrison looked at the stove like it was a piece of junk blocking his path. "That thing? It's ancient, probably not even worth moving." "It's worth everything to me." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes. Not empathy, recognition. He'd found the pressure point, the one thing that could break this man who'd refused to break quietly. 2 hours is 2 hours I don't have," he said. Then to his crew, "Take it." "No!" Elias moved towards the stove, but 2 of the workers stepped between him and the equipment, not threatening, just blocking. They didn't look happy about it either, but they had jobs to protect too. The other 2 workers grabbed the stove, 1 on each side. It was heavy, awkward, built to stay in one place. They struggled with it, grunting, dragging it towards the door. Elias's voice cracked. "Please, that's all I have left." Harrison checked his Rolex. "Everything's replaceable, Elias. You should have learned that by now." The workers hauled the stove outside, their boots scraping against concrete. The neighborhood had gathered again, watching this public execution of a man's dignity. Phones were out, people were recording, but no one intervened because what could they do against a man with lawyers and money and the law on his side? They lifted the stove over the edge of the dumpster and let it drop. The crash was sickening, metal against metal, the sound of something precious being destroyed. One of the burner grates cracked off and clattered onto the pavement. The custom vent Elias had installed himself bent at an unnatural angle. Elias stood frozen, staring at the dumpster like he was watching someone die. An elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been eating at Elias's garage for a decade, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "You're a cruel man, Mr. Sterling." Harrison didn't even look at her. "I'm a realistic man. Sentiment doesn't pay mortgages." He turned to Elias one last time. "You have 3 hours to remove anything else you want to keep. After that, it all goes in the trash." Elias finally found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "One day, you'll understand what you've destroyed here." Harrison smiled. "I doubt it." He walked back to his Mercedes, and that's when the sound cut through the morning air like a knife through butter. Low, powerful, getting closer. Engines, 3 of them, expensive engines that didn't apologize for taking up space. Harrison paused, his hand on the car door, and turned toward the sound. 3 black Lamborghinis turned onto the street, moving in perfect formation, sleek and predatory and impossible to ignore. The cars rolled to a stop, blocking the moving truck, blocking Harrison's escape route, blocking everything. And the doors opened. Three men stepped out simultaneously, tall, identical, wearing suits that cost more than Harrison's Mercedes. Their faces were carved from stone and memory, and when they looked at the dumpster, at the broken stove, at Elias standing there covered in dust and defeat, something in their expressions turned cold and final. Harrison's smile died on his face, because he'd just made a very expensive mistake. The street didn't just go quiet, it went silent in the way churches go silent when something sacred is happening. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, every phone lifted higher, even the pigeons seemed to pause on the power lines, watching. Three black Lamborghinis sat there like panthers deciding whether to pounce, their engines ticking as they cooled, their paint so black it swallowed light. Harrison recovered first, stepping away from his Mercedes with forced confidence. "You're blocking a work zone. You'll need to move." The three men didn't acknowledge him. They were scanning the crowd, moving their heads in unison like they were synchronized, searching for something specific. Their eyes passed over Harrison like he was furniture, passed over the workers, passed over the gathered neighbors. And then they found him. Elias. Standing there in his stained apron, dust on his shoulders, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, a broken man in front of a dumpster that held the last piece of his dignity. The three men moved toward him, and the crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear, out of respect for whatever was about to happen. Harrison tried again, louder this time. "Gentlemen, I'm the property owner here. If you have business—" The man in the middle, the tallest one, finally looked at Harrison. Just a glance, but it was the kind of look that makes men reconsider their entire lives. "We're not here for you," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, expensive. Then all three men stopped directly in front of Elias. Up close, they were identical. Same sharp cheekbones, same gray eyes, same presence that filled space without effort. They looked like they'd walked out of boardrooms and into a battlefield. Elias stared at them, his mind trying to place something familiar in faces that should be strangers. There was something about the way they stood, shoulder to shoulder, inseparable, like they'd learned long ago that staying together was the only way to survive. One of them, the one on the right, reached into his suit jacket. The crowd held its breath. He pulled out something small and held it up to the light, a brass compass, polished to perfection, the kind of shine that only comes from years of care. Elias's breath caught in his chest. Then the man in the middle pulled out his, then the one on the left. 3 compasses, 3 needles, all pointing true north. Elias's knees almost gave out. His hand went to his mouth. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." The man in the middle smiled, and suddenly Elias saw it. Behind the expensive suit and the sharp edges and the 15 years of living, he saw 3 skeletal boys huddled in an alley, clutching broken compasses like lifelines. "Hello, chef," Julian said, his voice breaking just slightly on the word. Silas stepped forward, his eyes wet. "We told you we'd find our way back." Caleb, the emotional one, the one who'd cried silently while eating that first meal, didn't even try to hold it back. Tears streamed down his face. "We came back." Elias couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only stare at 3 men who'd once been 3 ghosts, now standing in front of him like proof that broken things could be repaired. The crowd murmured, confused, curious, starting to understand that something bigger than gentrification was happening here. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the script had changed in a way he didn't control. Julian finally turned to Harrison, and his expression was no longer cold, it was colder. "You're Harrison Sterling," he said, not a question, a confirmation. Harrison straightened up, trying to reclaim authority. "I am, and you are." Julian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're the people who just bought your entire development project." The words landed like a bomb. Harrison's face went from confident to confused to pale in the span of 3 seconds. "That's impossible. Those properties aren't for sale." Silas pulled out his phone, tapped the screen twice, and turned it toward Harrison. "They were, as of 9:47 this morning. Cash offer, 40% above market, accepted 20 minutes ago." Harrison stared at the screen like it was showing him his own death certificate. Caleb stepped closer to the dumpster, looked at the destroyed stove, and his jaw tightened. "Is that his?" Elias nodded, still unable to form words. Caleb turned to Harrison, and all the softness drained from his face. "You threw away something irreplaceable." Harrison tried to recover. "It's just a stove. I'll compensate him for." "It's not about the stove," Julian interrupted, his voice hard as steel, and Harrison Sterling finally understood. He'd just destroyed the dignity of the only man these 3 billionaires had ever called father. Elias's voice finally worked, though it came out broken and disbelieving. "Julian? Silas? Caleb?" All 3 men smiled, and for just a moment they weren't billionaires in expensive suits. They were 3 scared boys who'd finally made it home. "It's us," Julian said softly. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd called Harrison cruel, whispered to the person next to her, "Those are the boys, the ones he used to feed." The story rippled through the gathered neighbors like electricity. The 3 homeless kids, the ones who disappeared 15 years ago, standing here now in cars worth more than most people's houses. Harrison's confidence was cracking at the edges. "This is touching, truly, but it doesn't change the fact that this property isn't yours anymore," Silas interrupted, his voice clinical and precise. "As of 9:47 this morning, Sterling Development LLC no longer owns this block, the 2 adjacent properties, or the Riverside lot you were planning to turn into luxury retail." Harrison's face went from pale to gray. "That's 4 separate deals. There's no way you could have—" "We've been tracking your movements for 6 months," Julian said. "Every property acquisition, every permit filing, every inspection you paid for, including the one you ordered on this garage 3 days ago." The crowd murmured. Harrison's jaw tightened. Caleb stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. 15 years ago, we were starving, living in alleys, running from a system that wanted to separate us." He looked at Elias. "And this man fed us. Not once, every single night for 3 weeks. He didn't ask what we'd done or where we'd come from. He just saw 3 hungry kids and decided we deserved dignity." Elias's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do anything special." "You fixed our father's compasses," Silas said, pulling his out again, holding it like it was sacred. "When everything in our world was broken, you gave us something that worked. You told us we'd find our way." "And we did," Julian added. "Foster care reunited us after you disappeared. A teacher noticed Silas's aptitude for mathematics, scholarship programs, business school. We built a tech company from a dorm room that went public 5 years ago." Harrison was doing math in his head, and the numbers were terrifying him. "We're worth $3.2 billion, Caleb said, reading Harrison's mind, "combined, and we've been looking for Chef Elias for a decade." Mrs. Patterson started clapping, then Mr. Chen, then the whole street erupted in applause and cheers. Harrison held up his hands, trying to salvage something. "Gentlemen, clearly there's been a misunderstanding. If I'd known about your history with Mr. Vance—" "You would have done exactly what you did," Julian cut him off, "because men like you don't see people. You see obstacles and opportunities, and you decided Chef Elias was an obstacle." Harrison's voice turned desperate. "I was just following standard development protocols. Raising property values benefits everyone." "Raising values for who?" Silas asked coldly. Not for the people who actually live here, not for the elderly woman paying $800 a month who will get pushed out by your $3,500 studios, not for the day laborers who won't be able to afford lunch once you bring in your artisanal sandwich shops. Harrison looked at his crew, at the neighbors, searching for an ally. He found none. Julian pulled out his phone and made a call. Send them in. 2 minutes later, 3 more vehicles arrived, not Lamborghinis, work trucks with company logos, construction crews. What's happening? Harrison asked, his voice small now. Julian looked at the dumpster, at the broken stove, at Elias standing there like a man watching a resurrection. We're building something, Julian said. A culinary training center, state-of-the-art kitchens, classrooms, housing for students, free programs for at-risk youth who want to learn a trade. He paused, and Chef Elias is going to run it. Elias's hand went to his chest. I can't. I don't have the credentials. You have something better, Caleb said, his voice fierce. You have the belief that everyone deserves dignity, especially when they're hungry. The words Elias had spoken to them 15 years ago, given back to him like a gift. Harrison stood there, his empire crumbling in real time, watching his carefully constructed world collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. He opened his mouth to speak, to negotiate, to find some angle that would let him walk away with something intact. Julian raised his hand, cutting him off before he could start. We're not finished. Harrison's throat tightened. What else could you possibly— Your other developments, Silas said, pulling up another document on his phone. The 3 properties you're leveraging for your downtown expansion, the ones you used this neighborhood's equity to secure. Harrison's face went white. Those are separate deals, completely unrelated to— Nothing's unrelated when you're operating on borrowed time and other people's misery, Julian said. His voice wasn't angry, it was matter-of-fact, which somehow made it worse. We're purchasing those properties too, all of them, today. You're trying to ruin me, Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb stepped forward, and his eyes held none of the softness they had when they looked at Elias. No, we're teaching you what you tried to teach this neighborhood. All 3 brothers spoke in unison, their voices overlapping like a verdict, that everything's replaceable, especially you. The crowd roared. Phones captured everything. Harrison's humiliation was going viral in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. One of the construction workers on Harrison's crew, a young guy who'd looked uncomfortable throwing the stove away, stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, we're done here. You can find another crew. 2 others nodded and followed him to their truck. Harrison's own people were abandoning him. Wait, Harrison said desperately. I'll pay you double. Some things aren't for sale, the worker said, and drove away. Harrison turned back to the triplets, his last shred of dignity hanging by a thread. You've made your point. You've humiliated me publicly. You've destroyed my business. What more do you want? Julian walked to the dumpster and looked down at the broken stove. You want to understand what you did here. He turned back to Harrison. This wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a man's history, his survival, the one thing he carried through fire and loss, and 15 years of barely holding on. Silas continued, and you threw it away like trash because it was convenient, because it was in your way, because you could. Caleb finished. That's who you are, Mr. Sterling, a man who destroys things because he can't see their value. Harrison looked at Elias, perhaps hoping for mercy, for some indication that the chef might ask them to ease up. Elias met his gaze with quiet dignity. I told you you'd understand what you destroyed. I just didn't think it would happen this fast. Harrison's shoulders sagged. He walked to his Mercedes without another word, climbed in, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. Through the window, the neighborhood could see his face crumbling, the mask of confidence finally shattering completely. He drove away slowly, and no one moved to stop him. There was no need. The man who arrived that morning with power and permits and the law on his side was leaving with nothing but the echo of his own cruelty. When his car disappeared around the corner, the street erupted again. But this time it wasn't just applause, it was celebration, relief, the kind of joy that comes when the weight you've been carrying finally lifts. Julian turned to Elias and his voice softened. "Chef, I need to ask you something." Elias wiped his eyes. "Anything." "The stove," Julian said. "Can it be fixed?" Elias looked at the dumpster, then back at Julian. "I don't know. Maybe. The frame might be salvageable, but—" "Then we'll fix it," Caleb interrupted, "and it'll be the centerpiece of the new training center, the first thing students see when they walk in." Silas added, "With a plaque that tells them the story, about a chef who lost everything and still chose to feed the hungry, about 3 boys who were saved by kindness, about why dignity matters more than profit." Elias's voice broke. "I don't deserve this." Julian stepped forward and did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He hugged Elias. Not a polite handshake, not a professional embrace, a real hug, the kind that says, "I'm home." "You gave us more than food," Julian whispered. "You gave us hope when we had nothing else. Now let us give some back." Silas and Caleb joined the embrace, and for a moment it was just 4 men standing in front of a garage, holding on to each other like they were the only solid things in a spinning world. The neighborhood watched, and more than a few people weren't even trying to hide their tears anymore, because they'd just witnessed something rare. Not revenge, not even justice, redemption. If you enjoyed this story, please comment your impressions and opinions in the comments. I'd be really happy if you left a like.